Daniel Carter was a respected businessman, a husband, and a father. Emily Ross was only 18, fresh out of high school, chasing excitement in a small town. When their paths crossed, an affair began that would shatter lives and leave behind a trail of betrayal, obsession, and murder. What started as a secret relationship quickly turned into a deadly game, and in the end, no one could have imagined just how far Daniel would go to protect his lies. This is the shocking true crime story of lust, deception, and tragedy. Thomas Bennett lived a life that seemed polished and complete on the surface. He was 47 years old, a father of two, and married for more than 20 years to Lavera, a woman who believed their marriage was built on loyalty and trust. Their home in the quiet suburbs reflected the image of stability and comfort. To neighbors, Thomas was the man who worked hard, provided for his family, and attended every school event for his children. He was the kind of man who offered to mow the lawn for elderly neighbors, donated generously to community projects, and carried himself with an air of responsibility. But behind this carefully constructed mask, something darker was taking root. Thomas was not content with the life he had built, and the image of perfection hid a secret that would one day unravel everything. The first cracks appeared when Thomas met Emily. She was only 18, a college freshman trying to figure out her place in the world. With youthful energy and a curiosity about life, she was drawn to people who noticed her, and Thomas, with his confidence and financial stability, seemed magnetic to her. Their meeting was casual at first, just a chance encounter at a cafe near her campus where Thomas stopped after work. He began to notice her regularly, lingering long enough to spark conversations that eventually slipped into something more personal. What started as harmless exchanges slowly turned into something dangerous. Emily, flattered by his attention, started to see him as more than a man twice her age. To her, he represented an escape from her chaotic upbringing, a chance to experience comfort, wealth, and affection she had long been missing. To Thomas, she was an intoxicating distraction from the routine of his married life, a reminder of the excitement he thought he had lost. At first, the affair seemed manageable. He told himself it was nothing serious, just a private indulgence that would stay hidden. He began sneaking moments with her between meetings, making excuses to his colleagues and his wife about sudden deadlines or urgent calls. He convinced himself that no one would ever suspect a man of his reputation. Yet, with each secret meeting, he sank deeper into a world he thought he could control, but never truly could. Every lie told to Lavra about late work nights or weekend errands pulled him further away from the man he appeared to be. Emily, young and eager, was thrilled by the secrecy and risk. For her, it felt like an adventure, something worth showing off in subtle hints to friends online, though she never revealed his name. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to weave a complex web of deceit. He became skilled at hiding messages, deleting call histories, and managing his time down to the last detail. But even the most careful lies left traces. Lavra noticed changes, small at first but impossible to ignore. The faint smell of perfume that was not hers lingered on his clothes. His phone became a guarded object, never left unattended, never out of his sight. There were charges on their joint account that made little sense: luxury dinners, expensive gifts, hotel bookings that were never explained. Lavra felt a shift in his energy too. He was present physically but distant emotionally, his mind elsewhere during family dinners or late evenings on the couch. For Thomas, the excitement of the affair fed a dangerous sense of invincibility. He felt alive in a way he hadn't for years, intoxicated by the thrill of sneaking around. But the more he indulged, the more reckless he became. The time he spent away from home stretched longer, and the lies grew harder to keep consistent. Emily's demands for attention grew louder as well. She was not content with brief encounters or hidden glances. She wanted more time, more gifts, more of his life. She dreamed of a future where she would no longer have to hide. Thomas, though, had no intention of dismantling his family for her. He wanted both worlds, the stability of his home and the passion of his affair. The tension between those two realities would soon push him toward decisions he could never reverse. The neighborhood continued to see him as a model husband. He still attended family barbecues, still smiled at Lavra in public, and still maintained the image of the man everyone thought he was. but the double life was beginning to take its toll. His sleep was restless, his temper shorter, and his constant worry of being discovered left him on edge. He told himself he was careful, but in truth, his carelessness was showing. One evening, after rushing home late, Lavra noticed the faint shimmer of lip gloss on his collar. She said nothing, storing the detail away with the rest of the unanswered questions building in her mind. Meanwhile, Emily began to see Thomas less as a secret lover and more as a man who owed her something. She believed she had sacrificed her reputation, her time, and her innocence for him, and she wanted him to commit. The imbalance of power between them created constant tension. She was young and volatile, while he was desperate to keep control. He thought he could manage her emotions the same way he managed the lies told to his wife, but Emily was not easily silenced. The seeds of destruction were already planted. What had started as a thrill had grown into something uncontrollable, with danger on all sides. Thomas's family life, his marriage, and even his own safety hung in the balance. Every time he left his home with an excuse, every time he lied about where he had been, he was edging closer to exposure. The life he thought he had carefully built was about to fracture, and once the cracks spread, nothing could hold it together again. The affair that Thomas thought would remain hidden was no longer just a secret. It was the beginning of a storm that would consume everyone in its path, leaving betrayal, obsession, and tragedy behind. Emily had stepped into Thomas's life like a spark in dry grass, small at first but capable of igniting a fire that could not be contained. She was just 18, barely out of high school, and already carrying the weight of a troubled home behind her. Her parents had separated when she was young, and she had been shuffled between unstable living arrangements for most of her childhood. College was supposed to be her escape, but the reality was harsher than she expected. She worked part-time, barely able to afford books and rent, and loneliness gnawed at her constantly. When Thomas began giving her attention, it felt like a rescue. He was older, confident, wealthy, and seemed to have everything she lacked. He told her she was beautiful, listened to her worries, and offered the kind of comfort she craved. She mistook his flattery for love, and soon she was deeply invested in the relationship. To Emily, Thomas was more than just a man she met by chance. He was proof that she could finally have stability. She wanted the expensive gifts he promised, the dinners in places she had never dreamed of going, and the security of knowing she wouldn't have to struggle anymore. Thomas, meanwhile, saw her as a thrill, something to fill the void of his mundane married life. Their goals were never aligned, and that imbalance was destined to erupt into conflict. Thomas thought he could keep her satisfied with money and attention whenever he chose to spare it, but Emily wanted more. She wanted permanence, recognition, and most dangerously of all, she wanted a future with him. At first, Thomas played along. He promised her expensive gifts and hinted at possibilities that he never truly intended to fulfill. He dangled fantasies of trips together, whispered suggestions that he might one day leave his wife, and spoke about the two of them as though they could build something lasting. These were words designed only to keep her quiet and attached, but Emily clung to them. Every promise sank into her mind as a future she believed was inevitable. The more Thomas gave her hope, the more impatient she became. She wanted what she had been told she could have, and when it didn't come, she grew restless. Her impatience quickly shifted into demands. She began texting him constantly, filling his phone with messages at all hours of the day. At first he brushed it off as youthful passion, but soon it became suffocating. She wanted him to answer immediately, wanted to know where he was, who he was with, and why he wasn't with her instead. When he tried to delay her or claim he was busy, she responded with threats. She warned him that she would reveal everything if he continued to ignore her. She hinted at posting their pictures online or contacting his wife. What Thomas thought was a secret romance had become a ticking bomb in his hands, ready to explode if he made one wrong move. Thomas began to panic. He knew what was at stake if Lavra found out. His marriage would collapse, his children would see him as a liar, and his professional reputation would be destroyed. He had spent years cultivating the image of a respectable man, and the thought of it crumbling terrified him. Yet, even with that fear pressing on him, he couldn't bring himself to end the affair. Emily was too much of a temptation. He convinced himself that he could find a balance, that if he just kept her calm with gifts and attention, she would not follow through with her threats. But Emily was not the type to remain silent. The relationship shifted into a toxic cycle. Thomas would pull away, desperate to focus on his family, and Emily would respond by threatening to expose him. He would then rush back to her with apologies and gifts, temporarily calming her down before the pattern repeated again. Each cycle pushed him further into despair. He couldn't tell anyone what was happening. To the outside world, he remained the picture of stability, but inside he was suffocating under the weight of lies. Emily, on the other hand, grew bolder. She started leaving hints online about being involved with someone older and wealthier. Though she never named him, the vague posts and cryptic pictures suggested something secretive and forbidden. Thomas saw them and panicked, fearing that someone might piece it together. He begged her to delete them, but Emily enjoyed the power she held over him. It gave her a sense of control she had never experienced in her life. For once, she was the one calling the shots, and she relished it. Their encounters became increasingly strained. What once felt like passion was now dominated by arguments, demands, and ultimatums. Emily wanted him to leave his wife, to commit to her fully, and to prove that she wasn't just a hidden secret. Thomas, however, had no intention of dismantling his family. He wanted both worlds, the comfort of his home and the thrill of his affair. That impossible desire put him in constant conflict with Emily, who refused to accept being hidden any longer. The pressure mounted until Thomas could hardly think straight. He lived with the constant fear that Lavra would discover the truth, that Emily would one day show up at his house, or that someone at his workplace would see them together. The lies that once felt manageable now tangled around him like a noose. Every new demand from Emily tightened the grip. Every new threat made it harder to breathe. He told himself he had to find a way out, but the lure of her youth and the danger of losing her control kept dragging him back in. Emily's desperation only fueled the crisis. She began hinting to her friends that she was in a relationship with a married man, enjoying their shock and curiosity. She liked the attention, the whispers, the idea that she was living a story bigger than herself. What she didn't realize was that every word spoken, every clue dropped, brought Thomas closer to ruin. His secret life was no longer safe in the shadows. It was bleeding into the open, threatening to destroy everything he had built. Thomas found himself cornered, trapped between the life he had at home and the life he couldn't let go of. The weight of his lies was unbearable, yet he couldn't find the courage to end the affair. His fear of losing Emily was just as strong as his fear of exposure. The contradiction consumed him, pushing him into darker thoughts he had never imagined before. He began to wonder if there was only one way to silence the chaos Emily brought into his life. It was a thought he buried deep at first, convincing himself it was just frustration, but the idea lingered, whispering to him each time Emily threatened to ruin him. What began as a secret thrill had evolved into something far more dangerous. The balance of power had shifted. Emily was no longer the naive teenager seeking affection, and Thomas was no longer the man in control. Their relationship had become a battle of manipulation, fear, and desperation. Each day that passed brought them closer to an inevitable disaster. The lies were too heavy, the threats too real, and the obsession too consuming. For Thomas, there was no safe path forward. Every decision he made carried consequences, and every choice pulled him deeper into a darkness that would eventually demand a terrible price. Lavra Bennett had always trusted her instincts. For years, she had built her life around her husband and children, believing that Thomas was the anchor who kept their family steady. But the unease that began creeping into her heart could no longer be ignored. His late nights, the unexplained expenses, and the way he avoided her gaze whenever she asked simple questions all pointed to something hidden. She tried to push the doubts away, convincing herself she was imagining things, but the evidence continued to build. Trust had once been the strongest part of their marriage, and now it was slipping through her hands like water. It started with the phone. Thomas had never guarded it before. He would leave it on the kitchen counter or beside his bed without a second thought. Now it never left his side. He kept it in his pocket, even in the bathroom. He put it on silent at night, and sometimes she noticed the faint glow of the screen under the blanket when he thought she was asleep. One night, when he forgot it on the dresser, Lavra saw her chance. With trembling hands, she unlocked it and scrolled through the messages. Her heart dropped as she read words that stripped away the illusion of their perfect marriage. The texts were from someone young, filled with affection and longing, clearly not a casual acquaintance. The truth was undeniable. Thomas was having an affair, and the girl was barely older than their daughter. Laura's stomach churned with betrayal, but she forced herself to stay calm. She did not confront him immediately. Instead, she decided to collect more evidence, something she could use if she needed to protect herself or her children. She began quietly monitoring his behavior, noting when he left the house, when he returned, and how often he made excuses about work. Every detail became part of her growing case against him. Her suspicions deepened when she checked their shared bank statements. The charges told a story of their own luxury dinners at restaurants she had never been to, boutique purchases, hotel bookings under false names. All of it confirmed what the messages had already revealed. She felt sickened by the betrayal, but her anger kept her steady. She knew this was no passing fling. It was something dangerous, something that threatened to shatter the life she had worked so hard to hold together. At the same time, Emily's behavior was becoming harder for Thomas to hide. The young woman had begun leaving cryptic posts, online photos of expensive gifts, captions about forbidden love, and vague references to someone who promised her the world but hadn't delivered. Lavra stumbled across some of these posts by chance while browsing social media. At first they seemed harmless, but soon she recognized details that struck her with chilling clarity. A watch in one of the pictures matched the one she had seen missing from Thomas's drawer. A photograph taken in the reflection of a hotel mirror showed the outline of a man's figure, tall and broad-shouldered, not unlike her husband. Each clue tightened the knot in her chest. Lavra began to see Thomas differently. Every smile, every casual touch, every word he spoke at home seemed hollow. The man she had loved for decades was living a double life, and she was just beginning to uncover how far it had gone. She wanted to confront him, to scream, to demand answers, but something inside her told her to wait. She sensed that the situation was darker than just an affair. The girl was young, reckless, and dangerous in her own way. Lavra felt that if she acted too quickly, the consequences could be far worse than heartbreak. Meanwhile, Thomas was unraveling. He felt the walls closing in on him. Emily's threats to expose him grew louder, and Laura's quiet suspicion was something he could almost feel when she looked at him. He was caught between two lives, unable to control either. At home, Laura's silence was more frightening than anger. She no longer asked where he was going, no longer pressed him about work, and no longer sought explanations. She simply watched him with eyes that seemed to see everything. At the same time, Emily continued to push him. She sent desperate messages begging him to leave his wife, then furious ones threatening to show up at his house or send Lavra the evidence herself. Every day became a test of survival for Thomas. He knew exposure was only a matter of time, and he became obsessed with finding a way out. He thought about cutting Emily off completely, but the thought of her unleashing the truth terrified him. He considered confessing to Lavra, but he knew it would destroy the family and leave him with nothing. In his desperation, his mind wandered into darker possibilities. He began to think of Emily not as a lover, but as a threat, an obstacle that stood between him and the life he wanted to preserve. Laura's investigation grew bolder. She followed him once, staying far behind in her car as he drove out of town. She watched as he pulled into the parking lot of a cabin on the edge of the woods. She didn't confront him that night, but the image burned into her mind. Why would her husband, a man who claimed to be stuck late at work, be hiding away in a secluded cabin? The answer was obvious, and it made her blood run cold. She now had not only texts and bank statements, but also a place, a physical location that tied him to his secret life. She returned home before he did, careful not to leave any trace of her surveillance. When he walked through the door hours later, smelling faintly of cologne and smoke, she forced a smile. Inside, however, her resolve hardened. She would not allow herself to be humiliated, and she would not let his betrayal destroy her family without a fight. She began quietly gathering everything she could: copies of receipts, screenshots of messages, photographs of his strange absences. She knew she would need them, though she wasn't sure yet when or how she would use them. What Lavra didn't know was that Thomas, too, was preparing. He had reached the point where the idea of eliminating Emily had taken root in his mind. At first, he dismissed it as impossible, but the thought kept returning, stronger each time. It whispered to him at night when he lay awake beside Lavara. It lingered in his mind during meetings at work. He began to see it as the only permanent solution, the only way to silence the chaos and keep his life intact. He justified it to himself, convincing his conscience that Emily had pushed him to this point, that she was leaving him no choice. Both Lavra and Thomas were moving in secret, each unaware of the full extent of the other's actions. Lavra, fueled by betrayal and the need for truth, was closing in with quiet determination. Thomas, consumed by fear and obsession, was preparing to cross a line that would change everything. Emily, caught in the middle, had no idea that her push for recognition was pulling her closer to a fate she could never escape. The tension in the Bennett household became unbearable. Every glance across the dinner table, every late-night silence, every unanswered question carried the weight of what was coming. The storm had not yet broken, but its shadow stretched over all three of them. The affair was no longer just about secrecy and desire. It had become a game of survival, and soon someone would lose everything. The night Thomas chose the cabin as the place to meet Emily, the decision was cloaked in pretense. He told her it was meant to be a romantic escape, a private getaway where they could finally be free of judgment and secrecy. To Emily, this seemed like a sign he was finally ready to give her what she wanted, a step toward the future he had promised but never delivered. She packed a bag with the excitement of someone about to begin a new chapter of her life, unaware that the man she trusted had been consumed by darker thoughts. For Thomas, this night was not about love or commitment. It was about silence. He had convinced himself that the only way to protect his family, his reputation, and everything he had built was to end Emily's life. Driving to the cabin, Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale with tension. His heart pounded with dread and adrenaline, a dangerous mix that blurred his reasoning. He told himself over and over that he had no other choice, that Emily had forced his hand with her threats, her demands, and her refusal to remain quiet. In his mind, she was no longer a young girl caught in a dangerous relationship. She had become the enemy, the one who held the power to destroy him. The rational part of him still hesitated, but fear of losing everything overpowered any sense of morality. Emily arrived with anticipation. She had dressed carefully, believing that this was their chance to connect without interruption. She brought along small tokens she thought he would appreciate, reminders of their bond. To her, the cabin represented a new beginning. To Thomas, it represented the end. The isolation of the place gave him confidence. Surrounded by woods and far from prying eyes, he believed no one would hear, no one would see, and no one would ever connect him to what he planned to do. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with silence. Thomas struggled to mask the conflict raging within him. Emily, oblivious, spoke with excitement about their time together, about what it could mean for them. Every word she said tightened the noose around his conscience. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, the hope that had carried her into this destructive relationship, and for a moment doubt flickered. He wondered if he could still walk away, if there was a way to end things without bloodshed. But the weight of her threats returned, and the fear of exposure silenced any thought of mercy. The hours that followed were tense. Emily sensed his distance but misread it as hesitation about his marriage, not about his intent to harm her. She tried to reassure him, tried to draw him closer, but Thomas's mind had already detached. He was cold, calculating, and ready to do what he believed was necessary. When the moment came, it was sudden and violent. The cabin that she had entered with dreams of love became the place of her death. Thomas acted swiftly, driven by panic as much as determination, and when it was over, silence filled the room once again. But it was a silence that would never leave him. He stood there, staring at what he had done, the reality pressing down on him like a weight he could not carry. The fear of being discovered now turned into a frantic need to cover his tracks. He moved quickly, clumsily, trying to erase the evidence of the crime. The isolation of the cabin gave him time, but not peace. Every sound in the woods outside seemed louder. Every shadow seemed to carry the gaze of judgment. He disposed of what he could, dragging Emily's body into the darkness beyond the cabin and leaving it where he thought it would never be found. In his mind, the act was final. The problem was gone, and his life could return to normal. But the stain of his actions clung to him. Driving home that night, Thomas was gripped by a hollow emptiness he couldn't shake. He rehearsed his alibi, preparing explanations for Lara if she questioned his late return. He told himself it would work, that no one would ever connect him to Emily's disappearance. When he walked through the front door, Lara was waiting, her expression unreadable. He forced a calm demeanor, gave excuses about work, and slipped back into the role of husband and father as though nothing had happened. On the outside, the mask held. On the inside, he was unraveling. Days passed, and Emily's absence did not go unnoticed. Her friends began to worry when she didn't show up for classes, when her phone went silent, and when her online activity suddenly stopped. Her family reported her missing, desperate for answers. The investigation that followed seemed, at first, to lean toward the possibility that she had run away. Emily's troubled past and cryptic social media posts gave authorities reasons to believe she might have left on her own. Thomas watched the news unfold with a mix of relief and unease. The less attention on him, the safer he felt, but he knew that the truth was buried in the woods, waiting to be uncovered. He played the part of a concerned citizen flawlessly. He spoke about the tragedy of young people going missing, comforted his wife when she mentioned the case, and even volunteered to help with search efforts in their community. Every word he spoke was another layer of deception, another mask to hide the truth. But Laura's instincts had not dimmed. She remembered the cabin, the secret trips, and the hollow explanations. Her silence became more deliberate, her watchfulness more piercing. Though she had no proof, she sensed that Emily's disappearance and Thomas's lies were connected. Thomas, unaware of how much Lara had pieced together, believed he had escaped. The tension that had ruled his days seemed to ease. He smiled more at the neighbors, joked with his children, and tried to convince himself that life had returned to normal. But the shadow of what he had done lingered. He could not sleep without hearing echoes of Emily's voice. He could not walk into the woods without remembering where he had left her. And though the world seemed to accept that Emily had vanished without explanation, deep inside he knew the past never stayed buried forever. The cabin became a ghost in his mind, a place he could never erase. Laura's quiet suspicion became another shadow, one that followed him everywhere. He had chosen the path of silence, but silence had a way of speaking louder than any confession. The perfect life he had fought to protect was now poisoned by the very act he committed to save it. Emily's absence was a void that demanded answers, and sooner or later someone would uncover the truth. For now, Thomas walked through his days pretending he was still the man he had once been. But beneath the mask, he was nothing more than a murderer waiting for the storm to return. The small town that once whispered quietly about the businessman and the young girl erupted into chaos when the investigation took its darkest turn. Evidence was pulled from places no one expected, exposing the layers of deceit that had covered the truth for far too long. The discovery of hidden cameras in the businessman's office, along with coded bank transfers and unexplained withdrawals, painted a chilling picture of someone who had not only betrayed his wife and family, but had also manipulated a fragile young girl into a dangerous game. The affair that began as a secret thrill had spiraled into something that neither of them could control, and the lies were now unraveling with terrifying speed. Detectives focused their efforts on the inconsistencies in the husband's statements, and soon after, new evidence emerged. A neighbor reported hearing loud noises and an unusual car pulling into the driveway the night the tragedy occurred. Surveillance footage later showed the young girl's car parked outside the home hours before the wife was reported missing. But what shocked everyone most was not her presence, it was the husband's attempt to erase the footage by bribing a local security technician. This reckless move exposed his desperation and highlighted just how deep he had fallen into the mess he created. The investigation no longer looked at a man trapped in circumstances. It revealed someone orchestrating a sinister cover-up. Forensic evidence revealed even more damning details. The wife's phone, recovered from a nearby river, contained half-deleted recordings she had made in secret. She had clearly known more than she let on. In the recordings, she mentioned her suspicion about her husband's relationship with the teenager and hinted that she had proof she planned to use against him. Her sudden disappearance no longer seemed random. It appeared deliberate, as though someone had wanted to silence her before she could expose the truth. Investigators began piecing together a timeline that showed the husband as the central figure in both the affair and the violence that followed. The young girl, who initially appeared as a victim, also began to show signs of deeper involvement. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed conversations that went beyond flirtation. She and the husband had spoken about starting a new life together, and even about how the wife stood in the way of that dream. Though she claimed she never took such discussions seriously, the messages added to the chilling possibility that she had knowledge of the impending crime, even if she had not committed it herself. The picture that emerged was one of obsession, control, and recklessness, with blurred lines between love, manipulation, and violence. The trial was one of the most closely followed events in the town's history. Courtrooms filled with neighbors, friends, and strangers alike, all eager to understand how a respected man could fall so far. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision, showing the affair as the motive and the wife's disappearance as the consequence of a web of lies. The defense attempted to cast doubt, arguing that the young girl's involvement was greater than she admitted and that the husband was being painted as a villain because of his infidelity. But the evidence told a story that was impossible to ignore. The deleted recordings, the bribery attempt, the financial irregularities, and the damning text messages painted him as a man willing to risk everything for lust and greed. When the verdict came, the town fell into silence. The husband was found guilty of orchestrating his wife's murder, while the young girl, though not charged as heavily, was held accountable for her role in covering up crucial evidence. The sentence brought closure for some, but for others it only deepened the wound of betrayal. A family was shattered, a young girl's future was destroyed, and the community was left to reckon with the darkness hidden behind closed doors. The story became a grim reminder of how easily obsession could turn into tragedy, and how quickly secrets could unravel into deadly consequences. Years later, the case still lingers in the minds of those who lived through it. The home where it all began remains empty, a symbol of the betrayal that destroyed more than just one marriage. The young girl, now older, struggles with the stigma of her involvement, while the memory of the wife serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when suspicion and secrecy collide with obsession and lies. The true crime story that shook the small town has since become a warning far beyond its borders, a tale of how dangerous a hidden affair can become when desire overshadows morality. The tragedy was not only about a husband who betrayed his vows or a teenager manipulated into a dangerous affair. It was about the irreversible damage caused when choices made in secrecy spiral into violence. Every person involved paid a heavy price, and the scars left behind continue to whisper their warning. Behind even the most ordinary lives, the darkest truths may be hiding, waiting to explode into tragedy.